Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another day of Vlogmas. Today I'm going to be doing another little book review in my ongoing series where I'm talking about the books that we're reading for my ongoing read-along of Anthony Powell's amazing book series, A Dance to the Music of Time. So today I'm going to be talking about the Military Philosophers, which was the November read for my read-along of A Dance to the Music of Time. As always, this video will contain some spoilers, so this is for people who are reading along with the series. If you haven't read the series up until book 9, The Military Philosophers, I wouldn't recommend watching this video because I will be spoiling a few things. So, The Military Philosophers. First, I will quickly go through the details of the plot. Quite a lot in this book, like a lot of stuff happens in this book. And then I will talk about some of the things I love about this book, a few of the characters, and also just a few of the interesting themes. So, this is quite an interesting book in terms of structure. I feel like in A Dance to the Music of Time, there are, in general, two different sorts of books. There are the books that are like scene-led, and then there are the books that are like character-led. So for example, I feel like A Soldier's Art, the previous book to this, is mostly scene-led, like there is one big day, evening in the middle of the book, which is like the main focal point of the book. And then there are other novels within the series that are mostly kind of led by Nick's relationship with one particular character. So for example, book 2, A Buyer's Market, is in many ways about Mr. Deacon. Book 4, Casanova's Chinese Restaurant, is in many ways about Hugh Morland. Book 7, The Valley of Bones, is in many ways about Roland Watkin. And book 9, The Military Philosophers, is in many ways about Pamela Flitton. So, in the first chapter in this, we find that Nick has moved jobs. He is now working with Peniston and Finn, who he met in the previous book, who had previously rejected him for a job working with the French, but he has now been accepted for a job working with kind of foreign liaison with the Polish. In his various meetings and duties, he runs across Wimberpool again, and he also runs across Peter Templar, who says that he's recently been disappointed in his relationship with a particular woman who found that he was a bit too old for her, and it's made him kind of want to be young and rejuvenate his life and look for something a bit more interesting to do with his work during the war. We also witness Nick kind of struggling with the military bureaucracy, specifically through a character called Blackhead, and he also in this chapter meets Pamela Flitton, who is in many ways the focal point of this book. And Pamela Flitton is the niece of Nick's old friend Charles Stringham. In the second chapter, Nick moves from working with Poland to working with Czechoslovakia. We also learn more about Pamela Flitton as a character, learning about her escapades and her relationships with men. She seems to be someone who enjoys kind of exercising her power over men and in some way enjoys kind of like emotionally destroying men. That's definitely the kind of impression you get a little bit from Pamela Flitton. We know that she has had some kind of dalliance with Prince Theodoric. We learn at this point that she is the young woman who Peter Templar was so disappointed about, and we also see that she has quite a lot of power and influence over Nora Tolland, and Nora Tolland, as has been heavily hinted in the previous books, is gay, and we can definitely see that Nora is quite attracted to Pamela, although whether Pamela is attracted to Nora, or indeed to anybody, is a little harder to judge. In this chapter we also learn that Charles Stringham is missing and presumed dead in Singapore. We also find out that General Conyers has died, and that his wife, who was once Miss Whedon, or known as Tuffy, who used to look after Stringham, now works for MI5, which is just kind of cool. It's kind of cool. I always like Miss Whedon. She's a very interesting character, and you can see that she's like an efficient person who potentially, as a woman in the age she is living in, has not really been ever allowed to fulfill her true potential until the war, and then I love the idea of Tuffy working for MI5. In chapter 3, Nick runs into Sunny Fairbrother, and they also run into Wimberpool, who they learn has been promoted, but Sunny Fairbrother distracts Nick to avoid the possibility of him having to salute to Wimberpool, which he really doesn't want to do. And he also tells Nick that Wimberpool has got himself into a bit of a scrape and a bit of embarrassment by making a fool of himself abroad while in Cairo with a young woman by the name of Pamela Flitton. Later in that chapter, during an air raid, Nick runs into Odo Stevens and Pamela Flitton, who seem to be having some kind of relationship. And they also there run into Mrs. Eardley, who we encountered many books ago, and now she appears mysterious as ever to tell the fortunes of those around them. And although Pamela does not really want her fortune told, Mrs. Eardley predicts that she is going to marry an older, jealous man, and that she is on the road to power. In chapter 4, we learn that Sunny Fairbrother is going to be married to Tuffy, or Miss Whedon, whatever you want to call her. In my head, she is always Tuffy, which again is something that kind of pleases me and also just feels quite strange. Nick and many of his colleagues go abroad in order to negotiate, and while there, he runs into his old battalion from the Valley of Bones and meets Kedwood, who barely recognises him at all, which I find such a powerful moment in many ways. This man who Nick has analysed so much really cleverly in this series, and yet for Kedwood, like, Nick is just so little and he's just kind of dismissed him from his mind. And while abroad, he also runs into Bob DePort, who tells him that Peter Templar has died abroad. In chapter 5, while at a party, Nick runs into Matilda, Hugh Morland's ex-wife, and he also there runs into Widmerpool and Pamela, who is now Widmerpool's fiancée. They are engaged to be married, but despite the fact they're engaged to be married, they don't seem to have a very good relationship. In fact, it seems quite bad when Pamela starts accusing Widmerpool of being a murderer and says that he was the cause of Peter Templar's death. Interesting, especially when we know that he is kind of like a few steps removed from being responsible for Stringham's death, in that he was responsible for him being transferred to the mobile laundry, which led to Stringham being posted abroad, which led to him almost certainly dying in Singapore. Later in this chapter we have the Victory Day services, at which Nick meets a man called Colonel Ferrez. Colonel Ferrez offers Nick a lift back to his office, and when Nick accepts this lift, he meets Ferrez's wife and stepdaughter. And his wife is Jean Templar, who we haven't seen for many, many books. And then finally, at the end of the book, war is now over and Nick is being demobilised. He goes to kind of give his kit back and be issued with new clothes because he's been wearing a military uniform for 6 years. And while there, he runs into Archie Gilbert, who we have not seen, I think, since book 2, A Buyer's Market. And also there learns that Widmerpool and Pamela have actually got married, despite Nick's belief that they never actually would manage to. So, general thoughts about this book. I have to say that The Military Philosophers is one of my least favourite in the series so far. I think because for me it's quite bitty. It's just a lot happens in this book and a lot of it is kind of very small scenes, whereas what I really love in Anthony Powell's books is when there are like that big extended really, really detailed scenes that he does in so many of his books, where like one evening or one event can take up like so many pages and be so thoroughly in depth. That's one of the things I really, really love about the series, but that's something that I think is slightly missing from The Military Philosophers. Also, as I have mentioned before, the 3 books set in the war I do find a bit confusing, and there are many things that I love about them and many reasons why I think they're fantastic and interesting, and it's such a really interesting look at the war from a different angle, not being like on the front line, but in the kind of bureaucratic complications and kind of diplomatic relations going on behind the scenes, which were so vital and so important during the Second World War. But I do just find it quite confusing, and sometimes I just don't really know what's going on and I don't really understand the ranks, and sometimes it is just a bit confusing. So I think it's worth bearing with that kind of thing. The next few books are much easier to follow if my memory serves me correctly, but I did find some aspects of this book a little bit confusing. Saying that, I think there are some really strong aspects of this book as well, and some things that I love about it. Pamela Flitton is such an interesting character, and I like that this book is in many ways focused on her, although she doesn't actually appear that many times, and a lot of the time we kind of see her several distance removed, or we kind of hear what people have been saying about her, and kind of just get the impression that everybody is talking about her because she fascinates so many people. I also, as always, love the writing here. I think there are so many beautiful moments and so many like really clever moments of irony. Like, I love when Finn tells Nick that he has to go and pick up a salmon and he's going to use the company car and he feels this is very dodgy of him, but because the war's over he's going to risk it. Like, it's just a wonderful kind of silly moment in so many ways, but also like just really nicely done. And I also love some of the writing and description, especially when Nick and one of his colleagues are out in an air raid and Nick describes bombs being like dragons. That kind of like surreal aspect of war is so clever and interesting and so well written. I also find this book incredibly moving in terms of the sheer quantity of death in it, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later when I talk about the themes in this book. But I think like the 3 books in A Dance to the Music of Time that are set during the Second World War are really, really powerful, just in the way that they display just the sheer quantity of people who died and just how much life changed from before and after the war and how many people were just no longer there. It's really a really powerful and such an interesting book. So before I talk about the themes, I want to talk about a couple of the characters. I only have 3 I want to talk about today, but I want to start quickly with Finn. I'm not going to say too much about him because he's not a major character, but he is quite an interesting one, especially because you get kind of different senses of him. On the one hand, you see this formal man who is dedicated to his job. On the other hand, you see a man who, to avoid responsibility, sometimes plays up his deafness rather a lot. And also a man who keeps his private life to himself, but does have kind of, he reveals to Nick towards the end of the war that his son-in-law was killed fighting, and that he feels it is incredibly unfair that his son-in-law never got any kind of medal or recognition, whereas he has a VC but he doesn't feel that he deserves it. And then there's also that moment with the salmon at the end, his kind of one moment of rebellion, going in the military car to pick up a fish, which I think is symbolic in two ways. One, in terms of this kind of small transgression taking on such a huge thing in Finn's mind because they have been at war and everything has been so serious, and also the kind of lack of food and comfort during the rationing of wartime means that this salmon kind of takes on this great kind of symbolic significance. I then also, of course, want to talk about Pamela Flitton. She's a very interesting character and one that is hard to read. And I think in many ways what Pamela Flitton seems to want is power. That is her main interest, because she doesn't really seem to like any of the men she goes out with, and she goes out with a lot. It seems to me that what Pamela Flitton wants is power. She wants control in some way or another. She never seems to be that interested in or that fond of any of the men that she goes out with, and she goes out with quite a lot. From Odo Stevens to Prince Theodoric to Wimmerpool, she picks quite a strange array of men, many of whom are quite a lot older than her, and many of whom you can't necessarily see why she would want to be with them. And a lot of the time it's quite interesting that she doesn't just kind of pick high-ranking people like Prince Theodoric. She just goes for anyone who she thinks she can have power over. It's not about kind of gaining power in the sense of being with really influential people. It's just her kind of desire to know that she has influence over people, which I find really, really interesting, especially because she seems to exert this kind of great fascination on people, despite the fact that she kind of treats everybody awfully. Like when we see her with Odo Stevens and when we see her with Wimmerpool, both of whom she is having a relationship with at the time, she just is really quite horrible to them. Like even, I don't like Wimmerpool that much, but you have to feel sorry for him when his fiancée just starts shouting that he is a murderer at a party. Like, what can you do with that? The idea that she kind of takes pleasure in having control and power over people and then kind of breaking them in some way is very, very interesting. It makes her quite an interesting character, especially because the reason that men are drawn to her seems not just to be about her beauty and the fact that she is very attractive, but also about the fact that she is cold and a bit manipulative, and therefore they're kind of all the more interested in her. If she is interested in power, I think in many ways that might suggest one of the reasons why she does end up marrying Wimmerpool, for the power he possesses and the interest in her for having power over him. Because also Wimmerpool is the kind of man who can stand his own ground and who probably will argue with her, and maybe that's something that in some way she enjoys. It's very odd, their relationship. Like, Nick is amazed at the end of the book when they have actually got married, and so are you as a reader, because it's very hard to imagine how a couple can come back from one of them accusing the other of being a murderer loudly at a party. Let's move on to talking about Wimmerpool. We've discussed why on earth Pamela might want to marry Wimmerpool, but why on earth does Wimmerpool want to marry Pamela? And I think this is partly to do with the fact that Pamela is very beautiful and attractive, and one, Wimmerpool likes that, but also it makes him look good and it makes him look more impressive than perhaps otherwise people think him. People often underestimate Wimmerpool, as we see throughout the series, and Nick often does, and in some ways Wimmerpool wants to show that he could be attractive to women by marrying someone like Pamela. But I think it's also, again, about power. The idea that there is some kind of status for being the man who marries a woman who a lot of people have wanted to marry, and also the idea that she is someone who it is very hard to have power over, because she usually has power over other people. And so in some ways, for Wimmerpool to have some kind of power over her is quite powerful for him, as a man who really likes power. He says two things to Nick at the party which are really, really interesting. One thing he says is, "I have come to the conclusion that I like power." I feel like I came to the conclusion that Wimmerpool liked power quite some time ago, but it's very interesting to hear him say that so outright, and that he knows now that is his ambition in life. What he wants is power. I've talked a lot before about how different he and Nick are as characters. Nick is someone who has no interest in power, though he does, I think, have an interest in purpose and kind of analysing people around him. But it's not really power that Nick is interested in, not remotely, whereas Wimmerpool, that is his driving force. And the other thing he says is something he says about Pamela, which I find both like it just feels sleazy but also weird. He says, "One can forgive anything of a little person who looks so decorative." Now it's interesting that that is the word he chooses to use about Pamela. It's not beautiful. He's not saying I forgive her because she's attractive. He's saying I forgive her because she's decorative, because she kind of decorates him, because she makes him look good by being next to him. It's not about the fact that she's beautiful for him, it's the fact that she is a decoration of him and that she makes him look better. Moving on to the themes in A Dance to the Music of Time, one of the big themes in this book has to be death. In the whole 3 books that take place in the war, there are a lot of characters that die, but in this one especially, we learn that Stringham is dead, Templar is dead, Mrs. Fox, General Conyers, Smith, the butler. It's very powerful in a long series like this to be suddenly aware that a lot of characters from the earlier books are just no longer here, they're just no longer present. And Nick talks about the fact that Stringham and Templar's death made Wimperpool in some way more important to him, to his own personal mythology. And so now his other 2 school friends are dead, Wimperpool takes on kind of even more significance, and in a way he does, I think, to the reader as well. Stringham and Templar have been 2 very recurring characters throughout the series, and now both of them are gone, and the shock of that in many ways is really powerful. I think again we also look in this book at the theme of kind of war and its disruption. The idea that nothing in war is quite as it would be in peacetime. Sonny Fairbrother and Odo Stevens breaking out Szymanski of prison is an absurd thing that could never happen in peacetime. The marriage of Tuffy and Fairbrother seems bizarre. The marriage of Pamela and Wimperpool even more ridiculous. Is that something that would ever happen if the world wasn't kind of turned upside down and on its head at this moment? There is constantly the suggestion throughout the war books that everybody is kind of expecting everybody to be having an affair, because this is just how the kind of chaos of war works. Nick talks at one point in this book about going to a concert with his wife Isabel, and when Wimperpool meets them, he inspects Isabel's face very closely in order to try and make sure whether or not Nick is there with his wife or with a mistress. He is in fact, of course, with his wife. Another thing I find really interesting to look at in this book is kind of administration and bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy of war. It's a side of war history that is seemingly dull but actually quite interesting to see how kind of everything worked from behind the scenes, and just the level of kind of administration and bureaucracy that was needed to be constantly at war. I find the scene when Nick goes to visit Blackhead really, really interesting. The great kind of strife and difficulty of navigating the kind of military bureaucracy. But also one of the reasons why I do find this book a little hard to follow is because Nick and his kind of work and responsibility of various different foreign officers is just, it's all quite complicated and it's all quite fiddly, and all of this is the kind of behind the scenes, not actively fighting stuff that is really, really important to the Second World War. Another thing I find really interesting in this book as a kind of theme is the kind of surrealness of war, but also the surrealness of the end of war. The idea that Nick says on this Victory Day celebration doesn't feel like victory because everybody's just exhausted. The country is shattered and worn out, and although they may have won, and although the war may be over, so many people have died and everybody is so kind of just worn out that it just feels very, very flat and low, and nobody really feels like there is anything to celebrate. Another interesting theme in this novel is, as always in this series, the passing of time. I find it quite interesting as well to note in this book the passing of time, because it's a book in which, one, several characters who we knew from the very beginning of the series are dead. You know, if you think of the characters we're introduced to in the first book, Stringham is dead, Templar is dead, Uncle Giles is dead, Mrs. Fox is dead. But also meeting the grown-up children of characters who we met earlier on. Pamela Flitton is Charles Stringham's niece, Jean Templar's daughter is an adult, which in many ways much more strongly shows the passing of time than anything else could. And when Nick talks about the end of the war and having been at war for 6 years, it really makes you think, sort of 6 years is an incredibly long time, it's a big chunk of your life. And Nick, going back to being a civilian, going back to ordinary life. He has barely written in the last 6 years. So many things have changed, so many of his old friends have died, and this kind of weird, surreal interlude from real life, you can't go back from it. And there isn't any sort of returning to how things were before. It's a really, really interesting theme that kind of hovers throughout this book. So I think that's all I wanted to say on the Military Philosophers. In the month of December, we're reading the next book in the series, Books to Furnish a Room. And that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. Please let me know what you thought of the book, and I'll be back tomorrow with another Vlogmas video.